sponsored by Riverside.
Well, it's so good to have Daryl on the show today. We're going to talk about an important issue today. We're going to talk about trust and how do we have it? How do we rebuild it? How do we create it when it's not there? Because in our culture today, there is such a lack of that going on. And I believe trust is at the heart of most of our conflicts and most of our problems. So we're going to dig into that. But before we get into the fun part of the conversation, we get a chance to know Daryl a little bit better. So Daryl, give us the best advice you've ever received.
So I'm not sure it was actually advice, but it was a role model that I saw. When I was 7 years old, my father was involved in a head-on collision with a cement truck. And he lost his leg and cracked his pelvis and broke his hip, crushed a couple of vertebrae in his back. And it had a profound impact on the entire family. But he never gave up. He rehabbed himself, went back to work. He could have just quit, but he never stopped. And he showed me resilience. He showed me the ability to continue on when things go wrong. And Jack Dempsey has a saying, a champion is someone who gets back up when he can't. My father was a champion, and that had a lasting impact on me.
I can imagine that not just hearing someone speak that, but to see them live that out in their life I can't imagine how much, when things got tough, you just remember the picture of your father fighting and never giving up. It just helps you power through some of the more difficult things that life throws at us.
Yeah. And there's a way forward, right?
There's a way forward.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced lately?
So a big part of the challenge for me, Keith, is getting the signal through the noise. I see, trust levels are some of the lowest we've ever seen. And we see this conflict. We see these complex problems in the world. And there's so many people talking about trust and how little we have of it and how important it is, but they're not talking about what to do about it. And that's what I've done for the last 20 years, is help people better understand what trust is, how it works, and most importantly, how to build it. And so I'm really trying to reach out, and I appreciate you helping me right now with your audience, but trying to reach out to folks and say, we can be intentional about this. Building relationships, building trust, it's a skill that we can all get better at.
Powerful. And that is so true, because I look around and you can't, I know in America, we struggle with the fact that we can't trust the people who we've always held as authority, like medicine. We can't trust media. We can't trust politicians. And if we get into that point, we stop trusting the people that we've given or in control of our lives, we're in a really dangerous place in our world. So how do we, like you said, begin to build back that foundation of trust? We can actually move together forward somewhere.
Yeah. And that's the, $1 billion question, I guess, right? Is, I was at a conference sponsored by Duke that was called Rebuilding Trust in Institutions. And they talked about government and media and artificial intelligence, technology. And they spent hours talking about the symptoms and how bad things were. And somebody finally said, isn't this about rebuilding trust? So what do we do? And they looked in the camera and they said, we just don't know.
Oh,
And I was sitting in the audience going, ooh, pick me, because this is what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Right.
So
that's amazing. Yeah. So let's dig in a little bit. So what separates you from those who talk about trust in the world today?
So I have this, and I'm a fairly humble guy. So this is a struggle for me I don't like to brag a whole lot. But I wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments at Duke in the business school there. And that experience made me sort of one of the leading theoretical experts on the topic. But then I went to work for McKinsey & Company, big management consulting firm. And they said, wow, you've got great client hands. Let's send you to the worst places possible. And so I had these lived experiences of trying to apply the model and build relationships in places where people didn't really want me to be there. I was injured in 2001 in a car accident, ended up with post-concussion syndrome. but started my own little company called Trust Unlimited, and started with a financial services group, trying to help them figure out how to build trust with their clients. After 18 months, they found out that the trust was the primary driver of the sales decision, that they were dramatically more trusted than any of their competitors. And they generated 75 cents of every new dollar that came into the industry in Canada for the next 2 years. So now all of a sudden I knew I had something that worked. And I started applying it all over the place to nonprofits, helped the Canadian military try to figure out how to build trust with the locals in Afghanistan. Worked in Luxembourg, worked around with companies from around the world. And so there's this practical applied experience that I have that isn't as common, combined with that sort of deep theoretical background. And there's elements of my model that just don't show up in other places. So I talk about context. And for me, trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability, right? The definition is trust is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how somebody's going to behave. So there's an element of uncertainty and vulnerability in that definition. And when we're deciding to trust, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. The first is, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty. The second is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And those things multiply together to give us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we can tolerate, that we're comfortable with. If we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do. And so building trust actually becomes fairly simple. It's, where does uncertainty come from? And how do we take steps to reduce it? Where does vulnerability come from? And how do we take steps to manage that, to get below that threshold so that people are comfortable? And so I was, to my knowledge, one of the first who had actually sort of unpacked that trust decision. Most of the research treated it like a black box. Something happens out here and then trust pops out the other end. But for me, if we understand, uncertainty comes from us as individuals, and it comes from the context that we're embedded in, we start to get a better sense of how we can take steps to reduce that uncertainty, to communicate more effectively with each other. And, the inclusion of context meant that I could explain why we trust some people without knowing anything about them. We go to a doctor's office, they say, take off your clothes, and you do, right? Now, Keith, I've tried that in other places. It does not work. And if we just take that example and move it from a doctor's office to a gas station restroom, it goes from credible to creepy in a heartbeat. Even if you've got the same two people, same dress, same language, it shifts for us. And so understanding the context was a really key element in understanding how to build trust, how to understand why we might trust people in one setting but not in another. And then the inclusion of vulnerability. Most of the trust research treats trust like a dichotomous variable. We either trust someone or we don't. And that's where our heads go as human beings as well. And the reality is that we trust some people more than others. And vulnerability gives us a way to measure that, to understand how deep those relationships are. And so, and I say that, and all your listeners are sitting there going, well, duh. Like, how did this guy get a PhD, man? Like, this just feels like common sense. And then I included perceptions of the outcome, because you and I could have the exact same experience, but have different stories about what happened. And if we're not co-creating that narrative, co-creating that story, there's a chance for us to really have a misunderstanding. And if we don't create a shared understanding of what a good outcome looks like, then I could think it was wonderful and you could think it was terrible for the same situation, right? And then in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike someone else. And this is where the hostile environments piece came. 99% of the trust literature treats people like rational actors. And I suspect you've met people before. We're not always rational. And the more extreme those emotional states become, the less rational we are. And we see the reason that we fail to stop these long-term disputes is because we're trying to use logic and reason in a profoundly emotional situation. And it just doesn't work. So that's what sort of sets me apart. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's good. Looking at our current situation, let's just pick an issue. So we just came out of this incredibly dangerous, hurtful, painful pandemic. A lot
Right.
of people lost trust in a lot of different well-established agencies during this. People
Yeah.
lost trust in their doctor. They may not go into the room now. He said, take your clothes off. They may not take their clothes off anymore because they don't trust the doctor.
Right.
Um, they don't trust science. They don't trust the government telling them the truth anymore. So let's just pick one of those three things. If you're trying
Yeah.
to build trust, say back in a government that you think was not honest with you, how does the government go about reestablishing itself as a trustworthy agency or
Yeah. And that's,
entity? I guess I would say.
yeah. So for me, there's the three most common levers that we talk about are the individual levers, and those are benevolence, integrity, and ability. Benevolence is the belief you've got my best interest at heart. Integrity is, do you follow through on your promises and do your actions line up with the values that you express? And ability is, do you have the confidence to do what you say you're going to do? Now, I believe there are 10 levers we can pull. Those are three of them. The problem that we face with government right now is that the context seems to be driving us to pick or to have people step forward who don't really have our best interest at heart. And part of the reason for that is, Keith, would you want your family subjected to the scrutiny that politicians' families get subjected to?
No.
Uh, no, right? Like, I don't want my kids having to bear the burden of me being in the political spotlight and having some people like me or dislike me and then be under the microscope constantly for that. I love them too much for that. I care about them. I care about their best interest. And so a lot of these political leaders that we get are people who don't give a crap about anybody but themselves. And I will say that about both sides of the political spectrum. You know, we have the context set against us right now. And so we're getting a real herd of narcissists who are really focused on being famous or having power or whatever, and they don't give a crap who gets hurt. So that's a real challenge. But if we go to the pandemic piece, let's talk about uncertainty times vulnerability equals risk. Our perception of vulnerability actually went up, right? Because of this pandemic and the impact it was causing, both the pandemic and the reactions to it created hardship for people. And so if our vulnerability goes up, then it's harder for us to trust. And what that means is that our uncertainty actually needed to go down, but instead it spiked. And some jurisdictions did a good job of managing the pandemic. I live in British Columbia. We had a woman named Bonnie Henry, and there are some people who don't like her, but she did an amazing job. She was head of public health, and she basically just came out, daily at the start to say, here's what we know, here's the approach we're taking, and the government stepped back and let her run the show with regard to how things were handled. The problem that we saw was that there were so many different rules in so many different jurisdictions. And the healthcare folks were really focused in on dealing with the disease itself. And they weren't as focused on economic impacts or mental health impacts. Their playbook was focused on dealing with the disease. And we saw some political leaders want to stick their thumb on the scale and be seen as heroes. And so they fostered a great deal of uncertainty. And what these entities should have been saying is, these are the recommendations we have right now, but our knowledge and understanding of the virus is going to change. And we're going to see different things happen, and the rules are going to change as we go along. But they didn't tend to say that. They tended to say, these are the rules. And then 6 months later, now these are the rules. And little understanding on our part of how our knowledge and level of certainty around how to handle this had changed. Little acknowledgement that they were fallible and that they could make mistakes. And so it was handled so differently in so many jurisdictions that uncertainty was just off the charts. And in those settings, people crave certainty. So they search for stories that make the world make sense for them. And so we see things like QAnon, and we see things like, anti-vaxxers becoming very vocal about, the validity of the vaccines, or and we see people arguing back and forth because they feel such a loss of control in their daily lives. And so for me, I talk about this in the book that I wrote. For me, the answer is to start trying to promote more certainty, trying to articulate how we're benevolent. So pulling that benevolence lever, pulling the ability lever in a way that makes sense to people, not just standing up and saying, I have credentials, follow me. Following the integrity lever, right? Pulling the integrity lever, being able to say, these are the overriding values. And so linking their actions with the story that explains how their actions align with their values. And, trust levels are the lowest we've ever seen because uncertainty is so high right now. And we're having a hard time understanding what the rules are.
So, talking about your book, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World, what led you to write the book?
So I was having these incredible moments with clients. I had one of my students in Luxembourg, because what I do is I get them to practice the skills. That's part of the course. So you have to go have conversations. And one of my students had chosen as the people to practice with his two sons. They were 5 and 3. And he was alienated from them because he'd been away working for most of their lives. And he said, I don't know, I'm terrified. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. It always seems to be the wrong thing. I lose my temper. I get frustrated. I think the relationship's broken forever. And so that was where he chose to practice the skills that I was teaching. And at the end of the semester, he said, it's completely changed. My kids run to me. They throw themselves on me. They fight over who gets to have dinner with me. They tell me they love me all the time. And so I was having that kind of impact on a regular basis, but it felt like I was dropping grains of sand in the ocean. And I wanted people to come alongside and pick up great big rocks. And so I wrote the book because God forbid something happened to me and the things that I know go away. I wrote the book to start to scale what I know. And I tried to include everything in it. So the whole model's in there. The 10 levers are explained. They're all, I try to give people approaches to pulling those levers. So questions they can ask, approaches they can take to successfully pull some of those levers. And then give examples, case studies of here's where I've intervened in situations and here's how that worked and here's what it looked like. I've also created a masterclass, same reason, right? Where people can watch and see role plays and get exercises to practice these skills, because that's how they really learn.
Give us an example of one of your levers and how you would work somebody through that. Just kind of give us a taste of it.
Yeah, so benevolence tends to be my favorite. That's having someone's best interest at heart. And, a lot of times we think that we pull these levers, right? And I'll have leaders say to me, I do all that. And then I'll say, says who, right? Because me telling you I have your best interest at heart, Keith, carries a lot less freight than you saying, Daryl, I really feel it. I feel like you've got my best interest at heart. And, when I'll be standing in front of a room full of parents and I'll say, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? And all the hands go up, right? Because of course they do. But when I turn the question and say, how many of your kids would say that? It's about a third. And it's somewhat hesitant, right? And so if it's not obvious in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, how does a leader make it obvious? How do we make it clear to friends and colleagues? Well, partly it's about including them in the conversation. And so I give people a template. I say, you're going to have a conversation with someone tomorrow, and this is what your listeners can do. They can say, I heard this guy, Daryl, he was talking about trust. He said that benevolence is really important. And that's having someone's best interest at heart. And I think I do that, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And the other person's going to go, oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Let me tell you about this time, right? And so it starts a conversation. And then you start to narrow the funnel a bit and you say, have you ever had someone you really have your back? What did that look like? What did they do? How did it feel? And now they're starting to think about situations where someone looked out for them and what it was that they did. And now we're starting to get a sense of what benevolence looks like for them. So we're getting hints. And we're priming them to think more about this. And then we narrow the funnel further and we say, what would it look like if I had your back? If I had your best interests at heart? What does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? And now we've created this moment of transparency where they can tell us, this is what success would look like for me. And we can start referring back to that when we're thinking about them and trying to be benevolent. We can say, you remember when you told me you wanted to get a promotion? Well, that, for me, as your boss, means I need to hold you to a higher standard. I need to start asking more of you so that everyone here sees that you're capable of taking on that next role. I need to make you more transparent, put you in the spotlight a bit more. And so these are all things associated with me trying to help you get where you want to get to, as opposed to me just asking more and more of you and not really being grateful. I had another student, we had this conversation. I said, tell me about a relationship that matters to you. And he said, my girlfriend. I said, great. When you go home tonight, you're going to talk to your girlfriend and you're going to say, my professor asked me today to think about a relationship that really matters. And I thought about you. That's step one. We're showing the person that we care about them, that we're thinking about them, that the relationship matters. Said, and then you're going to say to her, he asked me what mattered most to you. And I said, your family. Is that right? And I said, when she says yes, you're going to say, okay, so I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking that it's probably really important to you that I get along well with your family because they're so important. So I'm going to start spending more time with your family, having conversations, having lunches, trying to build a stronger relationship with them because it matters to you. And he said, okay, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to do that tonight. The next day he shows up in class. He's got this huge smile on his face. He says, my girlfriend says I'm allowed to talk to you whenever I want. Right? And so it's about having that conversation about showing your intent, showing that you have their best interest at heart, that you want to help them succeed. And it doesn't always mean being nice. We can have similar conversations around ability. It's our favorite lever to pull. I have these kinds of credentials, this kind of background, this much experience. But rarely do we include the other party in the conversation about what good looks like. And you helped me out with the email that you sent me that said, this is what a good podcast looks like. This is what matters to my guests. And we followed up on that with further conversation about what matters to your listeners. How do we create a podcast that's memorable for them? How do we help them go away and, after you hear this, have a conversation with someone and say, you know what, I heard this podcast and he had me thinking about what good looks like. What is excellence? And I have my own perception of what that is, but I've never included you in that conversation.
Right.
I have that conversation with my sons. What's a good dad look like? How do I become excellent? It's hard, right? It feels vulnerable. But it really starts to open up a way for us to be intentional. And you talked about building bridges, about having intentional conversations. This is what that looks like.
Which lever of those 10 do you find most difficult to teach?
So, wow. That's a really good question. It's like you do this for a living or something. Let's see. I think, when I talk about ability, everyone gets it. When I talk about integrity, most people get it. When I talk about benevolence, people struggle with that one. When I start to explain context, people are like, yeah, okay, so if I explain my situation a little more, if I, that's the way I can pull that lever. There are things that I can do to find overlaps or we can create shared wins so we can shift the context. But that benevolence lever seems to be a really hard one to pull. And God, when we start talking about vulnerability, people get really uncomfortable. And I'm starting to talk more about, leaders who are perfect don't need to listen to this part of the podcast because they're fine. But those of us who aren't, one of the powerful things to do is share our imperfections, is to be a little bit vulnerable and to say, hey, I don't have all the answers, or hey, I make mistakes. And that connects them at a level with those they lead in a way that virtually nothing else does. That willingness to be just a little bit vulnerable. And we have such a hesitancy to do that right now. And it's normal because uncertainty is so high. It's hard for us to willingly take on more vulnerability. But getting people comfortable with that. And Brene Brown was talking to the U.S. military, I think it was the Navy SEALs, and they said, we don't like that word, vulnerability. And she said, how about courage? Do you like that word? Because you explained to me when you've had courage without some level of vulnerability. And so, being a great leader is probably harder than it's ever been. It's a moving target. And that notion of being perfect is a flawed strategy. I hope that answered the question.
No, vulnerable means I have to, people might not like me if I'm vulnerable.
They may not, right? They may see you differently.
That's right.
But you could fall back on this, Keith. I love you, brother. If other people don't like you, I love the message you're on about, and I love the work you're trying to do. And if somebody else says I don't like you because of something you've shared with them, you come to me.
I'll do that because there have been a couple of podcasts people haven't liked. So,
yeah, I hope this isn't one of them. But if it is, then maybe it's meant to be, right?
I work a lot with churches, and one of the things that we're talking about, this idea of trust, is so critical in the Christian context.
Mm-hmm.
What happens? I mean, if you work with an organization where, like we talked about so far, where trust has been damaged, and I've worked in a place where I walked into a congregation and the previous pastors had a moral failure. And so the church did not trust that position of pastor anymore. And I would try to lead, and they'd push back and say, we don't need you to be doing that. We just need you to just stay in your lane, kind of a thing. And so I knew there was something there, but I didn't know what it was, how to rebuild that trust. If I'm walking into a situation like that as a leader, CEO, pastor, what's one of the first things you would say try to do to rebuild trust in an organization where the previous leader lost trust?
Yeah. So partly there needs to be an acknowledgement of the pain that people suffer and the loss of faith that they may have had, the loss of trust that they may have experienced. And then a level of transparency and empathy. And this goes for, whether you were the one who had the failure or whether you're trying to clean up that mess. And partly for me, it's so important to have the same vocabulary. I've worked with organizations where they've had struggles, and then I start to show them the model, and they're able to start having conversations and say, well, this is where the integrity failure was. Okay. So how do we take steps to try to make sure that doesn't happen again? And, what does good look like from a senior executive, from a pastor, from a CEO? We start having those open conversations, and we share a little bit of vulnerability ourselves because people have just been burned. And they are struggling to allow themselves to be vulnerable again because they don't want to get hurt again. So starting by acknowledging the pain that they've experienced, articulating your perception of that story, and giving them a chance to share it as well. So sometimes when I run into executives who are having conflict, I'll go to one and say, tell me your story. Tell me what happened. And then I'll go to the other one independently and I'll say, tell me your version of what happened. Tell me the story. And then I bring them together and I say, person one, I want you to try to tell me person two's story and explain to me what just happened from their perspective. And then I flip. And it gives them a chance to develop some empathy, to think about it from the other person's perspective, to create a shared narrative and correct misperceptions as they're going along. So those are some of the things that I use to try to handle or dampen those levels of emotional pain and suffering and help us move to start trying to systematically be more methodical about building trust.
Great. I love the content of your book. So, how is your book being received?
So, volume isn't as high as I would like, but people who've read it have just loved it. I got an email from an academic in the Netherlands who said, this is what I do for a living. I study trust. And it's, the consulting that I do, it's everything I do. Your book blew me away. And the comments I get back are, wow, it's so practical and accessible. And, there are things in there that I can actually do. Sometimes I do work with really high tech folks, and for them, human beings are just a mystery. Technology makes total sense, but man, people are so hard to fathom. And they said, it's like you gave me a formula. And I'm able to actually engage with people in a way I couldn't before. So lots of real positives. I just need to spread the word more, Keith. We all need to have this sort of shared understanding of the same vocabulary about how trust works and how to be more collective and collaborative about it.
You're right on point with that. As we started this conversation, that is the one thing I see so often in our society, just lack of trust and suspicion of people. And we assume the worst of people. And if we keep going down that path, we other people, as opposed to see them as human beings. I had a podcast earlier today where we were talking about how do you really add the human element to the person you're across the table from you disagree with? How do you see them as an individual? And she gave me an interesting point, and I love this. She said, would you look at that person and say to yourself, would they pull my kid from a burning car?
Right.
And chances are you say, I think he would. So then I can look for the good in that person, knowing they would probably save my kid from a burning car.
Right. Right. Well, and I have the good fortune of traveling the world with my seeing eye dog, Drake. And he has such a positive story about everyone we meet. And he elicits such a positive response that I see the world in a much kinder way, I think, than most do.
That's really great. So, Daryl, what are you excited about these days?
So it seems like the word's starting to get out. I think we have the potential to make things better, and I'm excited about that. I love having positive impact in the world. I love people being better off for having met me and engaged and had conversations. And I've got some really interesting clients coming on board right now. I'm excited about reaching out to audiences like yours and sharing this information and saying, we all have the ability to build trust. We can all get better at it too. And so that's what gets me excited. That's what keeps me going.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I love to ask my guests this question. This is my favorite question. What is a legacy you want to leave in the world?
Oh. I was nominated as one of the world's thought leaders on trust. I would like the world, if I had my way, the whole world would be able to talk about trust the way that I think about it. And a lot of the problems that we're struggling with, the big, hairy problems, the complex problems we're struggling with, we would be able to resolve. That's the legacy I'd like to leave. That I made the world a better place.
Yeah, that's kind of the point of the podcast, is to try to get that conversation going and help us build bridges across the divides and the chaos of our world.
Yeah. Yeah. And bless you for the sharing that message, brother. It's much needed.
Yeah. Is there anything I'm leaving out that I should ask you?
Well, I guess if people want to reach out, they're welcome to visit my website at trustunlimited.com. There's a blog section there that's got some articles in it. There's a link to my book. There's a courses section that has my masterclass in it. If you go to the About section, you can see a picture of Drake. He's the Director of Goodness, the DOG. And if they want to reach out to me personally, it's Daryl at trustunlimited.com. Anyone who wants to join me in the journey to make the world a better place, you're welcome.
Where can they find you on social media?
LinkedIn mostly. I think we're going to start an Instagram page. I have just started a YouTube channel called Trust Unlimited Podcasts. Hopefully this one will be on there.
Great. Well, Daryl, thank you for what you do. It is so critical, especially in these times and this season, to really begin to turn the corner on the animosity and the anger and the toxicity, and to begin to get more of a positive interaction with people, to see people as valued human beings created by the Creator God to do something amazing in the world. And thank you for what you do to help us to see that with trust, because I do think that is a starting point for us having critical, crucial conversation. So thank you for this time. And I really pray that your book takes off and gets in the hands of everybody. So I encourage my listeners to go out and buy a copy. And when you go to Amazon or wherever you find it, leave a review, because that's how people find out more about the book and share it with your family and your friends.
Thanks, Keith. And if I can be helpful to you in any way, you please reach out.
I will definitely do that, Daryl. Thank you so much.